This session is entitled Creation and Incarnation, and our speaker is a very distinguished professor here at Notre Dame, Gary Anderson. Gary Anderson is a biblical scholar and the Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Thought in the University of Notre Dame's Department of Theology. His specialization is in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, but because of his interest in the history of interpretation, he also works in Second Temple Judaism and early Christian sources. He's the author of Sin, A History, from Yale Press, 2009, Charity, the Place of the Poor in the Biblical Tradition, 2013, Christian Doctrine in the Old Testament, Theology in the Service of Biblical Exegesis, in 2017, and he is the co-editor with Marcus Bockmuhl of Creation Ex Nihilo, Origins and Contemporary Significance, 2017. Please join me in welcoming Gary Anderson.
Thank you very much. I guess we have all the non-football fans in here. I was going to turn off my phone so I could resist the temptation to check the score during my lecture, but won't do that. Okay. Today, I hope you all have the handout because we're basically going to go through the text on that handout and see the way in which the beginning of the Gospel of John, referred to as the Prologue, how it anticipates, or is anticipated would be the better way to state it, the relationship of creation to incarnation in the Old Testament. But before turning directly to the subject, I'm going to begin somewhat unusually with a non-sequitur that will certainly, at least for the first part of my lecture, seem completely unrelated, but will be very important about 2/3 of the way through when I'll pull it back in. So let me begin with the non-sequitur. Don't worry if you can't understand what it has to do with what I say, at least at the beginning, because it will be very relevant by the time we get to the end. Some of you may be familiar with a very great historian of medieval thought, Carolyn Walker Bynum, taught for a long time at Columbia University, and then moved to the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. She wrote an article called A Medievalist's Perspective on the Body in a journal called Critical Inquiry in 1995 that had an interesting vignette. She was mentioning how difficult it was to get her students at Columbia, undergraduate students, by and large secular, to appreciate in any profound sense why medieval Christians venerated relics. It seemed to be the most bizarre thing imaginable. And here I'm thinking in particular, or she was writing in particular, about contact relics, not bodily parts, but things that saints of the church had touched. Her point in this article was actually every person knows how important contact relics are if they just think a little bit about the everyday. And she began with an illustration from a movie, which I subsequently watched with my wife. Great movie, a British movie, Truly, Madly, Deeply, in which it begins with a woman deeply in love with her husband, probably in her 30s. Her husband tragically dies. He was a very skilled cellist. And a few days after the funeral, a neighbor comes by her house with her young son, 12 or 13 years old, I can't remember, wants to either borrow or purchase the cello. I don't remember that detail either, but it doesn't matter. The widow is shocked that she's asking for that cello, the personal, prized possession of her husband, and she refuses to let it go. Then what happens in the movie is that the husband begins to come back in kind of ghostly form. The widow is at first delighted, even though it's not a full bodily presentation of her husband. It's certainly better than nothing. And she enjoys having him around, even though he's cold, he's not physical. There are a number of things, of course, that are different from a real flesh and blood person, but it's still someone she can see and interact with. But as the movie goes on, she tires of this and decides it's time to move on with her life. Her husband has passed. It's time for him to disappear. But what's beautiful in the movie is the only way in which the husband can be made to disappear is for her to part with the cello. And Bynum's point, she doesn't quite say this, but I would say this: anyone who's dealt with the remains of a family member that you deeply love, certainly one of the most painful things to do is to go through their personal effects and send some things to Salvation Army, some things somewhere else, keep others. Very hard to do. Why is that the case? Because those material items aren't just material items. They possess within themselves something of the person who possessed them. That, Bynum argued, is really the logic of relics, and that movie, Truly, Madly, Deeply, is in a sense simply an exegesis of why people venerate relics and why the concept of relics is something that anyone could appreciate and understand with just a little reflection on quotidian reality. It doesn't mean having to jump into the theological stratosphere. It simply means thinking a little bit deeply about what it means to be a human being in the world. For purposes of this lecture, I like to refer to this phenomenon of the cello or whatever the items are that belong to someone that you loved who passed, that you find very difficult to part with, ontological leakage, as though something of the person, their ontos, has leaked into these items, and you can't squeeze them dry. That they become, as it were, part of the person. Okay, so that's the non sequitur, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. So let's begin with our texts. The first is from the Gospel of John, the Prologue. And this text, in very short compass, really establishes very nicely the theme of my lecture, which is the relationship of incarnation to creation. The prologue of John's Gospel begins by restating, paraphrasing, maybe a better way to put it, the very first verse of Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word. Do we have water? Oh, yeah, we have water. Man does not live by the Word of God alone, but also by water. All right. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, etc., over the first several verses, leading to the climax, certainly, of the prologue, where creation points, what creation is ordered to, that is the incarnation. And the Word then became flesh and tabernacled among us. I want to say really three things here about this text. First of all, I've already pointed to is the way in which the prologue tells the story of the incarnation in a way in which creation itself is ordered to this telos, or end event. The second element to point out here is the Greek here. The reason why I've translated it tabernacled, it's usually rendered dwelt among us in English translations, but the Greek word here, skenoo, literally means to tent and alludes to the story of the Exodus that we're going to turn to in a second. Here, this slide is a section from Father Raymond Brown, perhaps the leading Catholic biblical scholar of a generation past, commenting here on John 1:14 and his very well received and still widely read commentary on John. If the Word became flesh, he has not ceased to be God. The theme of tenting is found in Exodus 25, where Israel is told to make a tent, a tabernacle, so that God can dwell among them. The divine presence in Jesus overflows into 14c. We have seen his glory. We'll talk about that in a second. That's also an image from Exodus. In the Old Testament, the glory of God, kavod in Hebrew, doxa in Greek, implies a visible and powerful manifestation of God to men. Okay. Incarnation is then prefigured, we might want to say, in the Old Testament by the story of God's indwelling of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. And then finally, this is an excellent example of what we might want to call typological reading or figural reading. Both terms come from the notion of seal impressions, stamping coins, of making the image and then stamping out subsequent copies. It's what happens then in a figural illusion. Our originating image here is the image from the book of Exodus, which then, as it were, is stamped out again when we come to the Gospel of John. Okay, so much for our first text, the prologue. Now to the second two texts, the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus. The beginning of the book of Genesis here, we have the creation story. We'll read just the first few verses. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then, very important formula, I have it here in bold. I refer to it as an approbatory formula, God approving of the work he has done. We'll find 7 of these, not by accident, in the first chapter of Genesis. Our author is very interested in 7s, and this is simply one of many illustrations one could give of patterns of 7 that are embodied in the chapter. God saw that the light was good. God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, darkness he called night. There was evening, there was morning the first day. Now, we won't read the whole chapter, but the thing to notice as we go down the chapter, down the page, and I have marked them all in bold and numbered them, is that we have these 7 repetitions of what I call this approbatory formula. The 7th and final one then being on the second page at the close of chapter 1. And then what often happens in the Bible when we have these approbatory formulas used, and we have 3 or 4 good examples, so we actually can speak of a kind of template, is that the last one generally is more fulsome than the ones that went before. And so we know we're at the end when we see the fulsome form. We don't have to count them. And we can see that very nicely in number 7. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed, not it was good, but it was very good. Okay, so that's the first point I want to make, is the way in which these 7 approbatory formula mark out the character of the first chapter. When we turn to the book of Exodus, which is the third text here on your handout, we're going to see these approbatory formula return, slightly different framing of them, but there is again going to be 7 of them, and I have them numbered here on the page. Everything that Moses does here is done as the Lord commanded him, as the Lord commanded Moses, and you can see I've underlined each one and numbered them, 7 of them matching then the creation of the world. Scholars like to refer to the world, what the world is in macrocosm. The tabernacle or temple is in microcosm. It's, as it were, a world in miniature. How does the biblical writer establish that? Well, he describes the fashioning here of the tabernacle in terms that recall the fashioning of the world. And all of this is important too, because this is the way in which the Old Testament is going to disclose to its readers that creation is ordered to incarnation. Incarnation in its Old Testament idiom. God indwelling this building, and God having then intimate communion with the people he has called and chosen. And this is this image that's so deeply inscribed in the Old Testament is certainly the source then for our gospel writer in the prologue of John of taking this model and adjusting it now to fit a second act, we might want to say, of indwelling, God's indwelling the person of Jesus. So a couple of other things we could say that line up Exodus 40 with the book of Genesis. I mentioned the sevenfold approbatory formula. We could also look at the date that's given to this chapter, which I didn't provide, but it's the first of the year, New Year's Day, typically in the ancient world, a day associated with creation itself. The diction as well at the end of verse 33 of chapter 40. Our writer says that Moses finished the work. If you were looking at the Hebrew, you would notice that the vocabulary used there is exactly the same vocabulary found in Genesis chapter 2, verse 1, when our writer says that God finished the work of making the cosmos. So it's not only this sevenfold approbatory formula that's being taken from Genesis 1 and dropped down in Exodus 40, but the vocabulary, technical vocabulary used in Genesis 1 is then also redeployed here in Exodus 40 to describe the fashioning of the tabernacle. And then finally, of course, creation concludes with God resting on the seventh day. And though the Exodus text here isn't explicit about this, but in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, God's indwelling of the temple was often thought to be his taking rest in that place. Scholars have often said that the Sabbath is to time what the tabernacle or temple is to space. Again, making this same point of the homology, we might want to say, between these two moments. Here with my slides. If we go through the chapter, this is important. Let's just follow. Let's see if I can use this. It's not very good technologically. Shouldn't there be like a little arrow on this thing? Ah, there, how about that? Like if I point this into your eye, do you go blind? All right. That's like my little Groucho Marx. That's my little Groucho Marx routine. My wife always says you need to introduce humor, and my humor is basically that of a kindergartner, so do the best I can. Okay, so back to the Exodus. So I have here, this is a drawing of, this is a problem. We've got three screens, but I only can point to one, obviously. But this is the tabernacle, and then we have these pieces of furniture, as it were, that occupy both the holy room and then the Holy of Holies. And they are going to be described here in Exodus 40, and it'll be important just to take note of the description here. So let's read this, at least a portion of the text. Beginning here in verse 20 of chapter 40, the text reads, "He took the covenant," this is probably the tablets of the covenant, and put them in the ark right here, which would have included the Ten Commandments. He put the poles in the ark, which would have been like this, and then set the mercy seat. Hard to know how to translate that, but we'll keep that as a placeholder, the kaporet, on top of the ark. And then Moses brings the ark into the Holy of Holies and then sets up this curtain. This will become, in the Eastern Church, the iconostasis. This will actually have a huge role in the development of Christian architecture, often not appreciated. Or the rood screen in Latin churches. We no longer have it, of course, in contemporary, or we don't observe its structural importance any longer in the liturgy, but that would have been its importance certainly in the medieval period or in the Byzantine period, like this curtain here that would have blocked view of the ark. And then once that curtain is in place, of course, the ark cannot be viewed, even by the priests who come in for the daily liturgy. They come and do everything. They tend the bread at the table, the lamps, the menorah here, and then the incense altar at the back, but never seeing the ark. So I have all of those important items shaded in our text. We don't need to read all of them, but notice them: ark, table, lampstand, golden altar, and then we move out to the altar of burnt offering in the courtyard. Okay, one more slide. If we were to just summarize what we've said so far here in terms of a figural relation, we've looked at the way in which Genesis 1 anticipates Exodus 40. Creation is ordered to God establishing intimacy with the people he has chosen and loved. We have this very same formula applied in this figural relationship of the creation account in John 1:1, and then the indwelling in 1:14. Again, Father Brown, the Word became flesh, pitched his tent is how he's going to translate skenoo among us, and we've seen his glory. Very important, I didn't mention this, but in Exodus 40, this concludes with the kavod, the glory of the Lord, entering the tabernacle, where it can be seen by, the Israelites, that same notion of tabernacling and then visible glory that we see in John 1:14, again, is borrowed from Exodus 40. If the Word has become flesh, he's not ceased to be God. More on that in a moment. The theme of tenting is from Exodus 25. We already saw that. And then that we've seen his glory from 14c is also from Exodus 40. In the Old Testament, the glory of God implies a visible and powerful manifestation. Okay. On to our next text, which is going to be Numbers chapter 4 on your handout. And this is very interesting. This is really the kind of reverse of Exodus 40. I don't know how many of you ever had to put up a tent. It's a complicated procedure. Maybe you watched YouTube video to figure this out. Exodus 40, Numbers 4 is like our YouTube video, how to put up the tabernacle and then how to take it down. Exodus 40, we saw, is how to assemble the thing, especially how to assemble it for the first time. We looked at, in particular, the way in which the ark was treated and how the ark was put in the holy place, and then the veil was put up so that the ark could not be seen. Now in Numbers 4, we're going to see the logic of how to take this down. I can't go into full detail here. It would be a separate lecture, but chapter 4 of Numbers is very important. It details the way in which the Levites, who we could compare to deacons, perhaps, altar servers in the Catholic liturgy, are to assist the priests, that is Aaron and his sons, in the porterage, a better word to use here, of the tabernacle through the wilderness. The Gershonites, one portion of the Levites, I like to think of them, they were the Gary Andersons of the ancient world. They were evidently weak because they only carried the curtains, whereas the sons of Merari, I like to think of them as they had John Cavadini biceps. They were the ones that took the frame of the tabernacle. You had to really be buffed. I've tried to be buff my whole life, but it just doesn't come about. My trainer always looks, is that all you're lifting? Well, that's, my DNA can't do more than this. This is, I lift all the time, but, I'm still a 95-pound weakling. Anyways, so I would be Gershon, Merari, and then the Kohathites here, these are the most important of the three. They're going to be the ones charged with carrying the furniture inside the tabernacle, but this is where the chapter gets really interesting. The Merarites and the Gershonites later in the chapter, they simply are told to, pack these things up and carry them, and that's what they do. But when we get to Kohath, we see something very different happening. Aaron has to go in and dismantle everything, and only when everything is dismantled and properly covered, then can this Levitical clan come forward and take the items and carry them through the wilderness. So if we take a look, we'll just look at a small portion. I have again shaded here on this text the items in question that we saw from Exodus 40, the ark, table of presence, lampstand, golden altar, and bronze altar. But the description of how to take down the Ark of the Covenant is very interesting. It says there in verse 5, when the camp is to set out, Aaron and his sons shall go and take down the screening curtain and cover the Ark of the Covenant with it. In other words, they're not going to see it. They're going to take the screen off of its hooks and then walk forward with it and lay it over the Ark of the Covenant so it won't be seen. And then they'll put on it a covering of fine leather and cover that with a cloth of blue. And then when all is said and done, put the poles in place for its covering. So the question becomes why this extraordinary concern when we get to Numbers 4 for how all these items in the tabernacle are treated when we don't have that concern in Exodus 40. And the answer here is pretty easy to give. In Exodus 40, the glory of the Lord, the Kavod Adonai, hasn't entered into the tabernacle yet. But once it enters, everything changes. And here's where the concept, as it were, of ontological leakage comes into play. Or perhaps to be more reverent here and scholarly, we could talk about participatory dimension of the items in question here. In other words, once God assumes residence here at the back of the tabernacle, and it's good to recall the words of Flannery O'Connor, it's not just a symbol, but in the Old Testament, God actually indwells there. Everything in this building changes. It all, depending on its proximity, will participate at some level with the God who inhabits the building. There's where Carolyn Walker Bynum's notion is very good. In other words, the proximity of these pieces of furniture to the God who inhabits the building is like the relationship of contact relics to a saint. They participate in the deity who is there. Why is that important? How do we know that? Well, first of all, we know it from the way in which this chapter is articulating the extreme care taken to dismantle this material. Who can dismantle it and who has to supervise? But if we look down at verse 20, we see the most amazing statement as to why all the care is taken. It says in verse 20 that all this care must be taken so that the Kohathites not go in and look, see with their eyes the holy things even for a moment, otherwise they will die. In other words, this is the language used elsewhere in the Old Testament for why one can't see God. That's the logic given to Moses in Exodus 33. When he requests to see the presence of God, God says, no one can see me and live. And so Moses is denied access, certainly, to the divine face. And that same logic here then applies to the appurtenances here of the tabernacle temple. They participate somehow in the being of God, what I refer to as ontological linkage. They're like contact relics that maintain sufficient, they participate sufficiently with the God who indwells this building that the same type of care one would use in terms of seeing God, one uses with respect to these objects. I might say this also comes into early church usage where many of the Eucharistic vessels were also preserved from view from the common laity, again by what was the iconostasis, the chancel screen, because the architecture of the early church was following very closely the kind of theology of the tabernacle from the book of Exodus. But that's not really my point today. I want to now turn to the fourth text on our sheet, which is how all of this information comes to play a role in the Christological debates of the 4th and 5th centuries. See if I've hit all my slides. Yeah. Okay. So let's take a look here at Athanasius, which is the last text here on your sheet. Athanasius, some of you may know, lived in Alexandria, Egypt during the 4th century and was one of the chief figures in the Christological debates leading up to the Council of Nicaea. The creed that emerged from that council was a strenuous critique of the Arian heresy, which questioned the full divinity of Christ. One of Athanasius's arguments against the supporters of Arius was that insofar as they worshipped Jesus Christ, which the followers of Arius did, but continued to assert that the Word was just a creature, well, if they were going to hold both of these, that Jesus was a creature but they worshipped him, then they were, according to Athanasius, committing idolatry. The Arians, however, countered by claiming that their worship wasn't of Jesus per se, but Jesus, as it were, was a conduit who conveyed, as it were, their veneration to God the Father alone. Even though, quote, we reverence the Son, they explained, quote, we are certain that his glory ascends to the Father. But the Arians didn't stop here. They made the counter accusation that Athanasius and his circle worshipped a creature, since they weren't willing to qualify in any way their worship of Christ, even at the same time acknowledging that the humanity of Christ was created. For Athanasius, of course, this accusation was a sacrilege. He wrote, we do not worship a creature, never. Though Athanasius does concede that the human flesh, when taken on its own, is a part of creation, nevertheless, when it's assumed by the Son, becomes a part of God. It participates in God. But proving this, Athanasius found, was very difficult to do on the basis of John 1:14 alone. Sensing this problem, Athanasius directs his readers back to the Old Testament paradigm from which John 1:14 arose. It's a very important, I think, theme, really sub-theme of my talk today, the way in which the Old Testament continues to function in the early church as a independent witness to the character of the Incarnation. It's not just a system of promise and fulfillment, of Old Testament pointing to the New Testament, the fulfillment, so we can just dispense with the Old. That is not how the fathers read the Old Testament. The Old Testament was an independent witness to the notion of the Incarnation and was interpreted to that effect. And that's what we see very nicely in this text. So let's see what Athanasius then does in one of his longest scriptural arguments against the Arians. He says here, text 4, we would like your reverence to pose to them the following question. When Israel was commanded to go up to Jerusalem to worship in the temple of the Lord, where there was the ark, and above it the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat, was this a good deed or a bad one? If they were doing a bad deed, then why did people who didn't comply with the law, why were they punished? But if they were doing a good deed, through which in fact they were pleasing to God, must not these defiled Arians, whose heresy is the most shameful of all, be utterly deserving of destruction? For in that case they commend the ancient people. It's very interesting to follow the logic of the argument here. The Arians, of course, revere the Old Testament, as do the party of Nicaea. So if the Arians commend the ancient people, that is the Israelites, for the honor that they showed towards the temple, clearly willing to reverence it, the temple, as it were, participating somehow in the being of God, but do not wish to worship the Lord who is in the flesh as in a temple. There we go. The direction here is from the Old to John. It's not John here determining full stop everything we ought to think about Exodus, but the arrows point the other way, right? We can see that the originating model now helps unpack what's in the prologue of John for Athanasius, something I think that's been dramatically underserved and undernoticed in the modern era. Continuing down to the second paragraph, although they saw that the temple was made of stones, the ancient people didn't think that the Lord speaking in the temple was a creature, again, oracles came from God within the temple, nor did they scorn the temple and go far off from it to worship. But in accordance with the law, they went into the temple and served the Lord who spoke from the temple. This being so, how can one not worship the all-holy and all-sacred body of the Lord, which was announced by the angel Gabriel and fashioned by the Holy Spirit and became a garment for the Word? Therefore, the one who dishonors the temple dishonors the Lord who's in the temple, and the one who separates the Word from the body rejects the grace that was granted to us in the Word. I love this painting here ever so briefly here, but this is clearly modeled on the Holy of Holies, and these are the cherubs that would have sat on top of the Ark of the Covenant, here pulling back the veil and revealing here the source of God's indwelling. Here the Mother of God, and she in turn splitting her dress to reveal the womb. I always like to think of this in light of the Salve Regina, show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb. Whoops. Not very good at technology. The blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Okay, let me conclude here. What have we done here? Well, looking at our handout, we began with we began with the Gospel of John, the prologue. First point I made here with respect to the prologue is we can see here that creation is ordered to incarnation, a principle deeply that informs certainly biblical texts from the Old Testament to the New in very short form presented here in the Gospel of John. We then look to the Old Testament of how this image is already established in the relationship of the book of Genesis, creation in the book of Genesis to the erection of the tabernacle at the conclusion of Exodus 40. Then we compared Exodus 40 to Numbers 4, and we saw a startling difference here. It wasn't just assembling the tent, disassembling the tent, but when we disassemble the tent in Numbers 4, there's an extraordinary attendant danger to handling those items. Why is that? Well, the items have dramatically changed as a result of the indwelling at the end of Exodus 40. They're no longer elements of quotidian reality, but they participate in some way, mysterious way, with the deity who dwells therein. And it's exactly that notion of the tabernacle and its sacred furniture participating in the God who dwells therein that informs Athanasius when he tries to persuade Arius that in venerating the body of Christ, they're not worshiping a creature, but they're worshiping the God who tabernacled within. Thank you. That's my...
Thank you so much, Professor Anderson. We have plenty of time for questions. We have until 2:45, so I invite anyone who has a question to raise your hand and maybe just state who you are. And
I don't have enough answers for all that time. I'm going to run out of answers in about 10 minutes.
Father Philip Nolan, Dominican House Studies, Washington. Thank you for a great talk. I was wondering if you could say something about how to hold as complementary this idea of creation as ordered to incarnation with the New Testament language of Christ becoming incarnate to save us from our sins, so that the incarnation is somehow based on sin or a response to sin, rather than kind of out of the goodness of creation. How would you hold those together?
That's a separate lecture. That's a great question. I deal with that in my forthcoming book. If you leave $50 on the table in your address, I'll promise that I'll send a copy autographed when it comes out. I think actually the Old Testament can answer that question. I mean, I'll put scare quotes over answer. That was, as I'm sure you know, a disputed question through the medieval period. The relationship of creation to atonement and atoning sacrifice. I'll just say one thing. I'm being clever, but I can't do justice to that question without giving another lecture, and I'm not going to do that. But if we go here, I gave a lecture a while back at Mundelein on this subject, and my point of departure was an Orthodox theologian whose name now escapes me. He's from England. No. I think he's a convert. Not, and I'm pretty sure it was Andrew Louth. I have to look at my notes. I'm sorry, I don't remember. I wasn't preparing for that question. But in any event, there's a huge literature that's surfaced in the last decade or two about, the kind of glories of the Eastern tradition, that, the sacrificial character, the saving act of God in Christ is not emphasized. Rather, it's the incarnation that's the principal point. And what he does in this article, I'm pretty sure it's Andrew Louth, is he says that this is the primary arc of the biblical tradition, from creation to incarnation. And sin and atonement is a kind of secondary, sequence in this picture. Well, if we were looking at this, he's more sophisticated than the people who are let's say, sacrificial, but he becomes a kind of pawn in that, larger theological debate, I think, much to his discredit. But I like Andrew Louth, and what he said in the article was certainly worthy of attending. But as I was reviewing his arguments, I did think of this medieval question about the relationship of the incarnation to Christ's atoning sacrifice. And what I'd have to say here, but it's also, again, a separate lecture, part of my book, again, tongue-in-cheek. I don't care if you read it, I just hope you buy it. Is that Exodus 40 here is linked to Leviticus 8 and 9, and I do have a PowerPoint slide presentation in which I then, complicate this arc. And Leviticus 8 and 9 are about the beginnings of Israel's sacrificial service, and you can't really disassociate one from the other. In fact, the chronology of the Hebrew Bible is very interesting because it's hard to date the chronological sequence. It doesn't follow clearly the literary sequence of these chapters. And what's at stake there is the Bible's own refusal to separate the incarnate moment of the tabernacle from its sacrificial moment. So that's what I would want to say. For me, and it's also true of the kind of piety of the tabernacle temple as well. If you were to think of Catholic practices, it's not an exact match, but I like to think of the spirituality of the indwelling element here as akin to Eucharistic adoration, where the focus is primarily on the indwelling. I mean, obviously the sacrificial element is there. The elements come as a result of the Mass, but the focus is on the presence of God in the Eucharistic element, whereas the liturgical service of the Mass itself, of course, is sacrificial. But we have those two, I think, moments already grounded in the Old Testament as well. In fact, you can see the ongoing, let's say, adoration factor here from Exodus 40 in the contemporary veneration of the Western Wall in Jerusalem, which is very much, in accord with this. If God indwelled the temple there on the Temple Mount, then those Herodian stones, even though they're many meters away, participated somehow in that act of indwelling, and those stones today can be venerated. Anyways, I don't know, I hope that answers your question, but I really can't say much more than that. Yes.
Bo Bonner, Mercy College.
Lord have mercy.
Lord have mercy, that's right. With the question about the direction of meaning, interpretive meaning, do I have you right on this? Do you think part of the problem is when we say, oh, the early church is looking back, trying to interpret the New Testament with the Old, that we see that there has to be this sort of strict genetic historical meaning, like from there up to here. And what you're showing here is that there's a way in which they view the Old Testament as like parallel source that can continuously be referred to in order to clarify interpretive problems. And that's hard for us to sort of imagine because we have such a historicist way to imagine the New Testament being linked to the Old.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. I think I can remember reading as a Catholic commentary, very good commentators, I won't mention them, but on Ben Sira, they were reflecting, something Ben Sira had to say about the nature of the charitable act, and in their commentary they made this kind of disparaging comments about how it, really isn't the kind of charity you'll ultimately see in the New Testament. But, if you look at Augustine, for example, who loves Ben Sira, he never makes those kind of qualifications. He just takes Ben Sira at his word. So you find, even, theologically, orthodox individuals who feel when they read these materials, they always have to have kind of hierarchical, stepped relationship. Why is it that, you have that in the fathers of the church, I'm not going to deny that, but you also have the notion of the Old Testament, as it were, being a kind of first order discourse about the character and nature of God. And I think that was, partially due to the fact that they really thought that text, preached Christ. That, I think is a disposition well worth recovering. If we go back here, my first slide, here the biblical scholar I like best on this is Brever Childs. Here he's citing von Kampenhausen, a very famous German scholar from between the world wars, writing about the relationship of the Bible. The problem of the early church was not what to do with the Old Testament in light of the gospel, but rather the reverse. In light of the Jewish scriptures, how are Christians to understand Jesus Christ? And you can see that reflected in this statement from Thomas, and he's simply reflecting here Augustine, the Contra Faustum, and Augustine's great efforts to see, especially within the ceremonial law of the Old Testament, something of first order importance, because otherwise, as Augustine realized, Faustus was going to get the better of the argument. There had to be something in this material that had first order significance. It can't all just be pointers. There must be something there that's still worthy of our attention. Back there in the corner.
Hi, my name is Emma. I'm from the Catholic Worker in Portland.
Yeah, I remember that. Welcome.
Thank you. I had a question about the reading of the building of the tabernacle in relation to the golden calf. I know some scholars view the tabernacle as a response to the sin of idolatry with the golden calf. I'm thinking especially of A.J. Heschel, who views the building of the tabernacle as a kind of degradation of the Sabbath, that it's only in response to humanity's sin that we need, a space for holiness, or holiness in space rather than just holiness in time, or worship in space rather than just worship in time. I was wondering what you made of that, if you see this at all as a response to the tabernacle at all as a response to sin.
So there you have a problem in Jewish sources, which Heschel must be, articulating. I haven't read Heschel on this, but there's, as often happens in Jewish sources, there's many, many different opinions, so I'm not going to present this as the Jewish tradition, but there is a tradition that, understands the revelation of everything having to do with the tabernacle as occurring after the sin of the golden calf, which of course contradicts the order of our present Bible, but that, is part of a rabbinic dictum, ein mukdam ve'ein me'uchar b'Torah. There's no beginning, there's no prior or later in the Bible. You can, you're not constrained by the literary presentation in terms of your reconstruction of the chronological order of events. But that certainly isn't a position that is, it's not widely accepted by certainly medieval Jewish commentators, and certainly modern Jewish commentators have much less, are much less satisfied with it. I think as Christian readers of this, I certainly wouldn't opt for that. I don't see any reason why one would want to invert the chronology of events here and make that point. That being said, I think many people have noted, and I think it's accurate, that there are ways in which the completion of the tabernacle in chapters 30 to 40 constitutes a fit response to the sin of building of the golden calf. The story of the extraordinary generosity of the Israelites, for example, in Exodus 35, to provide the materials for the tabernacle is thought to undo, as it were, their coming forth with the materials for building the golden calf. And then, the whole back and forth. After the sin of the golden calf, God initially says this is a capital crime for which Israel will have to pay. All will die. Moses is able to talk God off that ledge, but God is still angry over those chapters, and Moses' work of intercession hasn't ended. God says he's not any longer going to accompany the Israelites to the promised land. And that's very important, I think, in terms of Exodus 40, because we can see there that Moses obviously was successful. God returns and makes his presence intimately available. So all of those threats that loomed so large in Exodus 32 and 33 have been, solved in a way by the time we get to Exodus 40.
It seems to me that something changes about the way that God's holiness affects physical things in space in Jesus. What I'm thinking of is the way that purity laws are needed in the Old Testament to make the temple cult possible. You're not allowed to go to the temple if you're on your period. You're not allowed to go to the temple if you've had intercourse. You're not allowed to go to the temple if there's all these different things that make you too impure to go to the temple, and it's not necessarily just a sinfulness. It's just you're just common. Holiness is a kind of sacred difference to the kind of ordinary run of things. Now, in the New Testament, you see in the Gospels sort of go out of their way to show you Jesus touching all of the same impure things that the Old Testament covenant prescribes that have to be eliminated for someone to be able to come near the temple or to touch a holy thing. I just wondered, what do you make of that? The way that Jesus' holiness is not the kind of antimatter to kind of profane and unholy things in the way that the temple is, and the temple in its accoutrements.
Well, I guess I would say in brief, that's not quite true. Certainly wasn't felt to be true by the fathers of the church, the design of early Christian architecture and liturgical rules. So you have in 3rd, 4th century, this isn't my area, but historians of the liturgy can show that, the Eucharistic vessels were, kept from view from the laity for precisely those reasons. It wasn't one for one, all the laws of purity, extended, but they didn't all die. There was a principle that, was observed to the 20th century, and among certain Catholics, I think it's still practiced by the Orthodox, of the quote-unquote churching of women having to abstain from coming to the Eucharist after childbirth in accordance with Leviticus 12 and what Mary did as well in Luke. So all of these things didn't completely die. That they were, in fact, become very, Abbot Suger in his book on cathedrals imagined himself as a new Bezalel, the artisan from Exodus 40. Eusebius, when Christianity becomes licit, imagines now we can finally design churches for public spaces, and Bezalel again is his hero. This is where they look. All of this stuff, and yes, things. And if you go to, I don't know if you've ever been to an Orthodox service and observe the way in which the iconostasis functions, it's at least in the Byzantine tradition, there was a deep sense that, these Levitical laws about priesthood and holy items continued. Benedict really says he doesn't address the architecture element as much, but in his last essay on the priesthood, talks about the way in which the Christian church already by 1st Clement, 96, 1st century, is adopting Levitical terminology to identify the leaders of the church, which, as Protestants know, is not in the Bible. That's why they, except unless you're Episcopalian, they don't refer to sacerdotal leaders as priests, because we don't have that term in the New Testament. They make an argument along the analogy of yours. All of this stopped. But the early church didn't understand it that way. Very early on, Benedict observes these, laws for governing behavior around sacred items, and the institutions of the early church were, pulled in, not verbatim, but they were pulled in to an extraordinary degree from the Old Testament.
But what do you think about how Jesus' physical body? He goes and touches lepers. He's touched by the hemorrhaging woman. He hangs out with the tax collectors and other. It seems like he's going out of his way to touch all the things that are forbidden. And if his body is the temple or the tabernacle, then that seems to have indicated like a change in the nature of God's holiness.
So yes, that's true. On the other hand, why is it that communicants want to take the Eucharist on their tongue? I don't, by the way, but people do. Why at the Holy Thursday service do the priests cover the elements with a cloth? Why is that? Yes, there's Jesus as the embodiment of God has his own special rules, but in terms of the liturgy of the church, the way in which Jesus' ongoing presence in the church, how that is treated, all the rules that govern it come right from here.
Thank you.
In the front row there, please.
Could you speak at least a little bit, if you so inclined, on how creation and incarnation plays out in the liturgy specifically? So this idea that Chrysostom has, and I believe Ambrose has it in some of his sermons, that the sacrifice of the Mass is itself a kind of recapitulation of Bethlehem, a second incarnation on the altar. Can you maybe speak to that, how this idea of creation and incarnation kind of going hand in hand even extends into the Holy Liturgy?
Well, again, I guess I could, but that'd be a whole different, talk. I think I mentioned with respect to the individual sacrifice and atonement, it would, to do justice to it, I would have to go in a direction I'm not prepared to right now. I mean, I love to talk. I'd love to keep you here till 3:30, but I think I'm gonna pass on that question. I'm sorry.
Yes, Rick, back there.
Hi, I'm Tracy Hotkin, University of Dallas. You spoke a lot about the physical presence of the Lord in the temple and in the Incarnation, adding a kind of divinity and holiness to the physical thing that the Lord is present in. And now, of course, being humans with bodies, kind of participate in that divinity of Jesus and being the same kind of physical thing that he is. So I'm wondering, does the holiness of the body in any way come from this kind of holiness bestowed by touch that you've been speaking of, or is it something entirely separate?
I'm not quite sure. I missed some of what. Can you say it a little bit louder and maybe more succinctly?
Yes. Jesus was a person with a body, just as we are. So in having that same kind of physical part of our being, does that help us participate in the holiness bestowed by touch that you've been speaking of? Or is it, like we're not physically touching Jesus, but we have the same kind of physical being. So is that related to the holiness you're speaking of, or is it separate?
So, I don't know if this will do justice to your question or not, but in my foundations class recently, I showed like a student here from my foundations class here, so I mentioned that. But we were looking at the Emmaus Road incident in Luke. First of all, we have an analogy here between the way in which the Godhead is related to the body of Jesus and the way in which the appurtenances of the temple are related to God. It's not a kind of one-for-one exact model that we can, go down and articulate all the way down, rationale. So that's the first thing to be said. But so we were looking at the Emmaus Road incident. There's a great depiction of Christ's appearance to the two disciples by Rembrandt, in which you can see it's the moment of Epiphany, because it's kind of Christ's head is illumined, and the two disciples are looking at Jesus and being illumined by his divine presence. It still has Eucharistic dimensions. If you take a look at the painting, it's quite interesting. It's not an inn as you might imagine it. There's like an apse behind Jesus. There looks like liturgical cloths spread on the table. There's a lot of ways in which Rembrandt brings the Eucharistic elements out, but we clearly see the focus of the portrait very much like the focus of Luke's story in the Emmaus Road. Well, you take Caravaggio, is really incredible. Of course, you have to realize Caravaggio's painting in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. But the disciples, their moment of illumination, and they're kind of bowled over by it, is seeing the transformed bread. They're not looking at Jesus, they're looking at the objects on the table. It's really quite incredible, actually. Jesus isn't the focus at all, but it's the Eucharistic elements. And as art historians have noticed, that Caravaggio painting is deeply dependent on the depiction of the Last Supper in Milan by Leonardo da Vinci, because he has the same thing. His depiction of one of the disciples immediately to the left of Jesus, it's like this, as Jesus points to the bread and the cup. And the whole point is the transformation of the elements. The whole emphasis is on the elements, not the person. That's what Caravaggio, borrows. And I think it's that move that then, brings into play all of these deep, you might want to say, Old Testament sensibilities about the sacred, the purity, required to touch. If you're, a person of sin, you shouldn't take the Eucharist. As I remember, I once taught a class on sin and forgiveness. I had Father Michael Heinz come and give a short talk on penance in the early church, and he made the remark, I wish I still had the sources here, but in the early church, the penitential manuals would forbid a soldier returning from battle to go directly to Mass and receive the elements, even if who he kills is licit. It's like Ukrainians killing Russians or whatever licit battle. I don't want to get into conflict or arguments here, but whatever licit battle you can imagine, a soldier legitimately killing, a foreign aggressor, that person couldn't just kind of turn around and then that afternoon jump into church and receive the elements. There had to be, a space, because taking of a human life, it wasn't a sin, so to speak, but it was something that, sullied your person. And there had to be a separation, a proper separation between receiving the elements and the person receiving them. That's very interesting, liturgical rule, and I think, recalls notions of purity. It's not simply the framework of sin and holiness that's at sin and innocence, I should say, but it is purity and impurity, and committing, killing someone is an act that renders you impure and had consequences for Eucharistic practice.
Colby O'Connor, Benedictine College. You spoke of creation as order to intimacy, but as soon as God begins dwelling in the tabernacle, he's veiled. So what's the connection there? Does veiling increase intimacy in some sense? And can we speak of Christ as being veiled by his flesh potentially?
Yes. Actually, I can't go into this. First of all, I'm not smart enough. I have a colleague, Father Maximos Constas, who teaches at Brookline, Massachusetts, at the Orthodox Seminary there. Wrote a great article on the iconostasis, and it's the way in which both it works as an architectural item in the East, but also how the architecture of the Greek Church becomes the site for thinking about the mystery of the Incarnation. That's one of the most interesting things about the article, is that the building of the church, what you actually see in the construction of the church, is a occasion for thinking about the relationship of God to the material world. Now, what was the point I was going to get to here? What was the question?
Veiling.
Oh, the veiling. So I had him come and talk here. He gave a great analogy. He said, kind of imagine if I was like holding, an angel on the palm of my hand. It was invisible. You couldn't see that angel, but the angel had sufficient materiality that if I dropped a cloth on top of him, you would see the outer form. And that's a beautiful thing in the article, that actually the veiling makes possible the seeing. which is a beautiful notion. And he thinks that's also his argument about the iconostasis. It's not about blocking vision, but enabling vision. I highly recommend the article. I can't do full justice to it. I'm not that smart, but it's really good.
Yeah, I was wondering, you talked about the well, using the second quote down there, in light of the Jewish scriptures, how are Christians to understand, in light of the Jewish scriptures, how are Christians to understand Jesus Christ? And you talk about the first order significance of this discourse.
Mm-hmm.
So what about the moral and social codes that from Mount Sinai? Is there a first order discourse, morally speaking, there, or how do you differentiate between what we should still read in that way versus what we would see in terms of typology that illuminates who Christ is?
Well, I don't want to say it's all just first order discourse. I mean, the relationship between the testaments is an element, and what do I want to say? A topic for continued theological elaboration and discussion. So, but I guess what I wanted to say with respect to this example, I think for modern thinkers, the relegation of the Old Testament as it were to the dustbin, or simply the promise, now we have the fulfillment, is so strong that I think that people are surprised that that's not the way the fathers of the church or the medievals read this material, that there was something of first order significance here. Not everything by any means, but there was a lot of things of first order significance that was attended to. And I simply illustrated one here, but my purpose of my talk was not to run through the whole Old Testament on that score. Again, we'd be here till the next Notre Dame football season. We're going to do that.
Time for just a couple more, maybe. Yes, in the back there.
Hi, I'm Kira. I'm a philosophy student here. I just had a question about you used the phrase ontological leakage, and I was just wondering, could you explain how that happens for Christ's body and for the temple? But I was just wondering, what would be going on if you think that there's a kind of ontological leakage going on with relics and saints? Because I guess they're not God, so is it that something about the ontological presence of human beings can also leak onto objects, or is the idea that God was present in these saints and so then he leaks?
The example I used, ontological leakage, was from Truly Madly Deeply, and I was alluding simply to anyone who's attended to a family member who's passed and having to deal with all the things that they own. You can't simply, treat them as you would other objects. They retain something of the identity of the person. They continue to participate in the reality of the person. I said that was simply an analogy to understand how the ancients understood the pieces of the temple, that they also, at some level, participate in the God who dwells therein. I love this. I found this in the Magnificat once when I was preparing a lecture on this subject. From the Blessed Concepcion. I never had not known her before I read this, but they all have to do with adoration. But I love this. O Jesus of the Eucharist, O consecrated host, and then, O envied monstrance. Right? You can see that we go from Jesus to Eucharist, the Caravaggio. We could see, John Calvin would be nervous here. Consecrated host, okay, John Calvin. Envied monstrance, idolatry, right? Idolatry. Oh my God, you're confusing creation, a creature, with God. And the whole beloved of my heart. So there we go. She didn't hear this lecture. She's not deriving this, I think, from the book of Exodus, but she's deeply sensitive, I think, to this dimension of the sacred. And it's very much this explains, as it were, the kind of theology of her exclamation here. If you understand her, you can understand Caravaggio's painting of the Emmaus Road, of the disciple there, not ignoring Jesus, not even looking at him. Whoa! At the food.
Time for one more question. I thought I saw someone back there.
Andrew Skiff, St. Thomas, and former student of Gary Anderson's. He was my thesis advisor, so good to be back in class with you. And it really is. I love hearing you present. It's always a pleasure. My question is, would you draw a thread between the Kohathites and the Apostle John? The Kohathites entrusted with a particular way to care for the elements like of the tabernacle, and the Apostle John, who's entrusted with care for Mary by Jesus on the cross.
I mean, I suppose you could do that. I mean, I guess the one-for-one, correspondence, I get a little bit nervous about. I guess to me, and I guess I'm more interested in the kind of the liturgical dimension. So I guess I would see the Kohathites like the deacons or altar servers as analogies to them handling the sacred items of the liturgy. But what you suggest isn't completely wrong. It's just not maybe the direction I would go.
Great. Well, I think we have a down payment on several future lectures, given the questions. Thank you very much.